Judge Hamilton's hand froze over the gavel. The mahogany handle felt heavier than usual, weighted with the gravity of what everyone expected him to do. Federal Courthouse, Room 302. October 14th. The gallery was packed with reporters from major newspapers, FBI agents in identical dark suits, and spectators who'd lined up since dawn for a seat at what would become the most talked about sentencing in federal court history, all waiting for the inevitable. Bumpy Johnson, the King of Harlem, was about to be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. What you're about to hear is a dramatized reconstruction, inspired by historical context and reported events. The case had dominated headlines for months. Harlem numbers king finally caught. FBI cracks Johnson empire. The Protestant had called it the most significant organized crime conviction in New York history. A victory that would send a message to every illegal operation from the Bronx to Brooklyn. But then Hamilton opened the manila envelope that had mysteriously appeared on his bench during the afternoon recess. Security had no record of anyone entering his chambers. His clerk swore she hadn't seen it arrive. It was simply there, placed precisely in the center of his leather desk pad. Inside, a single black and white photograph, professionally developed, crystal clear. And what would follow would be 47 seconds of absolute silence that would redefine the relationship between law, power, and loyalty in America. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand who Judge William Hamilton was in 1957. This wasn't some corrupt politician or mob-connected official. Hamilton was a Presbyterian Sunday school teacher who'd never missed a service in 23 years. A Harvard Law graduate who'd finished third in his class, appointed by President Eisenhower himself after a rigorous vetting process that included comprehensive FBI background checks. His judicial record was impeccable and widely respected in legal circles. In 5 years on the federal bench, Hamilton had never been overturned on appeal. Never shown favoritism, never bent a rule. He'd sentenced bank robbers, tax evaders, and bootleggers with mechanical precision that earned him respect from colleagues and fear from defense attorneys. His attention to detail was legendary. He lived in a neat Tudor house in Scarsdale, with his wife Margaret, a former school teacher, and their 2 children. Hamilton lived in a world of absolutes where moral lines were clearly drawn. The law was the law, handed down through centuries of legal precedent and constitutional authority. Justice was blind, impartial, based on evidence rather than emotion or social consideration. Criminal behavior demanded punishment regardless of who you were, where you came from, or what personal circumstances might have led you to break federal statute. And Bumpy Johnson, by every legal standard, every piece of evidence presented, every witness testimony recorded, was undeniably guilty. The charges were federal conspiracy, tax evasion, and operating an illegal gambling enterprise across state lines. The evidence was overwhelming, methodically assembled over 5 years of FBI surveillance. 47 witnesses, including former associates who'd accepted immunity deals to testify against their former boss. Detailed records of Bumpy's numbers operations stretching from Manhattan to Philadelphia. Financial documents showing unreported income exceeding $2 million between nights. The prosecution had surveillance photographs of Bumpy meeting with policy bank operators, wiretap recordings of coded conversations about territorial disputes, testimony from bookkeepers who'd maintained his illegal ledgers for years. They'd traced money flows through legitimate businesses that served as fronts, documented protection payments to corrupt police officers, mapped out the entire organizational structure of Harlem's underground economy with the precision of a corporate flowchart. Lead prosecutor James Mitchell had called it an airtight case during his closing arguments, comparing the evidence to building blocks that form an unshakable foundation of guilt. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Even Bumpy's legendary defense attorney, Clarence Webb, had advised his client to plead guilty from the beginning, hoping for judicial leniency that might reduce what could be a life sentence to 15 manageable years. But what the prosecution didn't know, what the FBI didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that 18 months earlier, Judge Hamilton had faced the most terrifying night of his life, and the man sitting at the defendant's table had saved him from losing everything that mattered. March 23, 1956. Hamilton's 16-year-old daughter, Rebecca, had been missing for 36 hours. She'd gone to see a jazz show in Harlem, with 3 friends from shop and school, privileged Manhattan girls who'd grown up in penthouses and Long Island estates, suddenly fascinated by the vibrant culture their parents had spent decades teaching them to avoid. Upper East Side girls looking for adventure in a world that existed 20 blocks north but might as well have been another continent. Rebecca never came home. Her friends returned to their families with confused, frightened stories about losing track of her in the crowd at the baby grand, about the music being too loud to hear her when she said she was going outside for air, about assuming she'd taken a taxi home when they couldn't find her later in the chaos of the late-night crowd. Hamilton called the police immediately, pulling strings that federal judges rarely used and never discussed publicly. Detective squads from the 24th Precinct canvassed every club, restaurant and hotel between 110. Missing persons reports were filed with Rebecca's photograph distributed to every patrol car in Manhattan. Hamilton used his federal connections to have FBI agents interview witnesses, but their badges and official authority seemed to make potential sources disappear rather than cooperate. After 2 days of official investigation yielding nothing but dead ends and blank stares from Harlem residents who'd learned not to trust federal authorities, Hamilton's wife Margaret made a suggestion that terrified him more than any criminal he'd ever sentenced. Contact Bumpy Johnson. Everyone knew, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly, that nothing happened in Harlem without Bumpy Johnson's knowledge or permission. He controlled policy banks that employed hundreds, provided protection for black-owned businesses, settled disputes that prevented territorial wars. If a young white girl from Manhattan was in trouble above 110th Street, there was only one man who could find her. Hamilton agonized over the decision for 6 hours, pacing his study while Margaret sat silently. His Presbyterian upbringing warred with his desperation. This was a federal judge considering asking a criminal for help. Everything he believed about legal authority told him to wait for proper channels, but everything he felt as a father told him that systems meant nothing if they couldn't protect what mattered most. At 11:47 p.m. on March 25th, Judge Hamilton walked into Small's Paradise on 35th Street. The club was alive with late-night energy, saxophone melodies drifting through cigarette smoke, conversations mixing business with pleasure. Hamilton was the only white face in the crowded jazz club wearing a conservative suit that screamed federal authority. Conversations died as he moved through the crowd. Everyone knew who he was, knew why he was there. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at his corner table playing dominoes with 3 older men. When Bumpy saw Hamilton approaching, he didn't show surprise. He simply nodded to his companions, who quietly left the table, and gestured for Hamilton to sit. "Judge," Bumpy said quietly, "you look like a man with problems." Hamilton had rehearsed what he would say during the cab ride uptown. He'd prepared arguments about civic duty, about shared humanity transcending racial and social boundaries. Instead he said 5 words: "My daughter is missing." Bumpy. What happened next challenged every assumption Hamilton had about criminal behavior and moral character. Bumpy Johnson didn't negotiate, didn't ask for favors, immunity or future consideration. He simply said, "Tell me everything," and listened as Hamilton described Rebecca, her friends, the club they'd visited, the last known locations. After Hamilton finished describing Rebecca, Bumpy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Judge, I don't know you personally, but I know your reputation. You're a fair man, hard but fair, and any man's daughter deserves to come home safe." Bumpy made 2 phone calls from the club's payphone, brief conversations in coded language that spoke to networks Hamilton couldn't access, relationships built over decades. The first call went to someone named Illinois, the second to a woman Bumpy addressed as Sister Marie. What struck Hamilton wasn't just the efficiency of Bumpy's network, but its motivation. These weren't favors called in through fear. People wanted to help Bumpy Johnson because he'd helped them, because he'd proven himself as someone who protected the community.
Within 90 minutes, Bumpy had located Rebecca, through a chain of information that ended with confirmation she was safe, but scared at an after-hours spot in the Bronx. She wasn't kidnapped or harmed. She and her friends had gotten drunk, ended up at an after-hours club in the Bronx, and been too embarrassed and scared to call home. They'd been staying with a jazz musician who kept them safe, but didn't want to get involved with police. But what struck Hamilton wasn't just that Bumpy had found his daughter, it was how he'd handled the situation. No violence, no threats, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet conversations with people who trusted him, connections built on respect rather than fear. Rebecca was brought to Small's Paradise, scared but unharmed, and Hamilton held his daughter while silently reassessing everything he thought he knew about the man across the table. "Judge," Bumpy said as Hamilton prepared to leave with Rebecca, "your daughter learned something about the world tonight. Maybe you did too." Hamilton never spoke publicly about that night, never mentioned Bumpy's help to his wife, never told his judicial colleagues, never included it in any memoir or interview, but he also never forgot it. Never forgot that the man the FBI called a dangerous criminal had helped a desperate father without asking for anything in return. 18 months later, that memory sat heavy on Hamilton's conscience as he prepared to sentence Bumpy Johnson to what would effectively be a life sentence for a 60-year-old man. October 14, 1957, 2:47 p.m., Hamilton had reviewed the case files one final time during the lunch recess. The evidence was clear. The law was unambiguous. The sentence was predetermined, 20 years minimum. Federal guidelines suggested 25. There was no legal discretion that would allow for leniency. Hamilton returned to his chambers to collect his thoughts before delivering the sentence. That's when he found the manila envelope on his desk. No name, no return address, no indication of how it had gotten past court security. Inside, a single photograph. Hamilton and Rebecca, leaving Small's paradise on March 20. Both faces clearly visible. The moment of a father embracing his found daughter captured forever. There was no note, no threat, no demand, just the photograph and the implicit message. I ate your secret. Will you keep your promise to be fair? Hamilton stared at that photograph for 10 minutes. The weight of 18 months of silent gratitude, pressed against 27 years of judicial integrity. He thought about Rebecca, safely enrolled at Wellesley College, pursuing her dreams because she'd come home safe that night. He thought about Bumpy Johnson, sitting in the defendant's chair, facing the end of his freedom for operating the same network that had saved Hamilton's family. At 3:15 p.m., Hamilton returned to room 3. The gallery was full, anticipation thick in the air. Bumpy Johnson sat calmly at the defendant's table, hands folded, expression unreadable. He didn't look toward Hamilton, showed no recognition of their shared history. The court reporter Sings hovered over her stenotype machine. FBI agents leaned forward, ready to witness the conclusion of their 5-year investigation. Reporters had their pens ready for the inevitable headline. Harlem numbers King gets life sentence. Hamilton looked at his sentencing notes, then at the photograph still in the manila envelope. Their eyes met for the first time since that night in Harlem. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but Hamilton saw quiet acknowledgement of justice's complexity in the real world. Mr. Johnson, Hamilton began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone only he could hear. The court has reviewed the evidence presented during this trial. The prosecution has built a compelling case regarding your involvement in illegal gambling operations, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges. Hamilton paused. The courtroom held its breath. However, after careful consideration of all factors, including your role in the community, your lack of violent criminal history, and certain mitigating circumstances that have come to the court's attention, another pause, longer this time. 47 seconds of absolute silence, while Hamilton made the decision that would define the rest of his judicial career. This court finds that justice would not be served by the recommended federal sentencing guidelines. Therefore, I am dismissing all charges with prejudice. Johnson, you are free to go. The courtroom exploded. Reporters shouted questions. FBI agents looked at each other in disbelief. The prosecution team demanded an immediate appeal review, but Hamilton simply gavelled for order and walked out of room 3, leaving behind a chaos that would generate headlines for weeks.
What nobody in that courtroom understood was that Hamilton hadn't made this decision to repay a debt. He'd made it because Bumpy Johnson had taught him something about justice that law school never could. Sometimes the letter of the law conflicts with the spirit of justice. Sometimes a man's actions in his community matter more than his violation of federal statutes. Within 24 hours, Hamilton faced an FBI investigation, a judicial review panel, and calls for his impeachment. He never explained his decision beyond stating that mitigating circumstances had influenced his judgment. He retired from the federal bench 2 years early, returned to private practice, and lived quietly until his death But Hamilton's decision had consequences far beyond that courtroom. Word of what happened spread through Harlem, like wildfire, then through New York's underworld, then through the entire East Coast criminal network. A federal judge had recognized what the community already knew. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a numbers runner. He was a problem solver, a protector, a man who'd built something more complex and valuable than the FBI's files could capture. The dismissal changed the dynamic between law enforcement and Harlem's power structure. Police had to acknowledge that sometimes the unofficial authority figures were more effective than official ones. The FBI began recruiting informants differently, recognizing that community loyalty ran deeper than federal prosecutions could penetrate. And Bumpy Johnson? He walked out of that courthouse and returned to Harlem, where he continued operating for another 11 years until his death, and never arrested on federal charges again. Not because he stopped running numbers or managing territory, but because everyone, prosecutors, judges, FBI agents, now understood that some forms of power transcend legal authority. The photograph that changed everything disappeared from Judge Hamilton's files the day after the sentencing. Nobody knows who placed it on his desk or how they gained access to his chambers, but the message was clear. Respect operates on multiple levels, and real power isn't always defined by courtrooms or badges. Years later, a reporter asked Hamilton if he regretted his decision in the Johnson case. Hamilton was 73 years old, living in retirement in Connecticut. He thought for a long moment, then said, I sentenced men to prison for 40 years based on evidence and law. With Bumpy Johnson I had to consider evidence the law doesn't recognize, what a man means to his community, what he does when nobody's watching, who he protects when there's nothing in it for him. The reporter pressed, but didn't you violate your oath as a federal judge? Hamilton smiled. I upheld my oath as a human being. Sometimes those two things conflict. When they do, you have to choose which legacy you want to leave behind.